Kristen C. Blinne is a communications scholar at SUNY Oneonta, where she is a professor in the Department of Communication and Media, and affiliated faculty in Women's and Gender Studies, whose work integrates ethnographic research, arts-based and contemplative methodologies, critical pedagogy, and social justice-oriented communication. Her scholarship explores mindfulness, storytelling, activism, and relational forms of inquiry, emphasizing compassionate, participatory, and community-centered approaches to studying and practicing communication. Blinne's published work includes ethnography on the rainbow family and contributions to alternative, embodied, and creative modes of qualitative research. Her broader academic profile reflects a sustained commitment to understanding how communication practices can support ethical engagement, inclusive learning environments, and everyday forms of social justice. The 2016 paper, Me, Myself, and IRB, A Rainbow Quest to Who Manize Ethnography, explains that the author spent years studying the rainbow family, a loose community that holds large peaceful gatherings, and found that traditional university research rules do not fit the way this kind of open, collaborative fieldwork actually works. Instead of following fixed plans, the research unfolded naturally through conversations, shared activities, and participation in the group's way of life. The author argues that this kind of research is more about building trust, being honest, respecting people's choices, and avoiding harm than about collecting data through formal procedures. Because the rainbow community values privacy and protection from misrepresentation, the author ultimately chose not to publish the full fieldwork, seeing this decision as the most ethical outcome. The paper then suggests rethinking what research and human subjects mean so that ethnography can better match real human interactions, emphasizing care, mutual respect, and genuine collaboration. The author explains that her work is driven by a long-standing belief in peaceful, compassionate, and nonviolent ways of communicating. She sees communication not just as an academic subject, but as something that can help people interact with greater understanding and care. This commitment is tied to her involvement in activist work, where she tries to promote social justice and help communities engage more ethically with one another. She also notes that she helped create a new activism and social justice division within the National Communication Association. This shows that her interest in activism is not just personal but also something she brings into her professional and academic environments, encouraging others to think about communication as a tool for positive social change. Finally, she situates this essay within the context of the nearly 5 years she spent doing fieldwork with the rainbow family. Her time with them taught her that their way of living and interacting did not align neatly with the strict rules used by universities to regulate research. As a result, the essay grows out of her struggle to connect the free-flowing, communal, and participatory nature of rainbow gatherings with institutional expectations that demand fixed procedures, clear boundaries, and formal approval processes. In Me, Myself, and IRB, the author introduces the rainbow family of living light, a loose, leaderless community that meets each year in national forests to pray for world peace and live together in a temporary, cooperative community. The group is not organized like a formal organization with officers or a clear hierarchy. Instead, people come together voluntarily, share responsibilities, and create a kind of short-term, alternative society focused on peace, spirituality, and communal living. The author describes how her project with the rainbow family began as something closer to a creative experiment than a traditional scientific study. She originally wanted to write an ethnographic novel that mixed real experiences with imagination, blending fact and fiction, dreams and daily life. Because of this, her work did not match the usual expectations of university ethics boards, which assume that research will be planned in advance, follow fixed methods, and separate real data from made-up material. This leads her to ask some basic questions. Does what she is doing actually count as research in the official sense? If it does it have to go through formal review by an institutional review board, IRB? And if scholars present their work as art, performance, or storytelling instead of as research, how should that work be treated by universities and their rules? These questions highlight the clash between flexible, creative forms of ethnography and rigid institutional definitions of research and human subjects. The introduction also lays out the main goals of the essay. The author wants to join ongoing debates about how IRBs should handle ethnographic work, especially when it is collaborative, artistic, or experimental. At the same time, she wants to put forward the idea of ethnography as an ethical spectacle, meaning a kind of public, ethical performance that shows not only how a community currently lives, but also what kind of better world it might be reaching for. Instead of focusing only on describing what is, she wants ethnography to help people imagine what could be. In Got Research, the author explains how federal rules define research and human subjects in very strict ways. According to these rules, research must be a planned, systematic project designed to produce generalizable knowledge, and a human subject is someone from whom a researcher gathers identifiable information or interacts with in a controlled way. These definitions form the basis of what IRBs are required to oversee. The author argues that these definitions assume research is something tightly organized in advance, with clear steps and predictable procedures. This works for lab studies or surveys, but not for ethnography, where researchers often learn as they go, respond to real-life situations, and develop relationships that cannot be scripted. In this kind of work, knowledge comes from being with people, not from carrying out pre-planned interventions on them. Drawing on scholars like Katz, the author points out that ethnographic research is often messy, changing, and impossible to outline fully ahead of time. As a result, many ethnographers cannot meet IRB requirements, which expect a fixed plan before any fieldwork begins. Because of this mismatch, some ethnographers end up working underground, informally or without official approval, simply because their methods do not fit the system's expectations. This creates a serious ethical dilemma. IRB rules prohibit researchers from interacting with people or collecting information until they are approved, but ethnography depends on real-time interaction, building trust, and adapting to situations as they happen. The IRB framework and the nature of ethnography pull in opposite directions, leaving researchers stuck between institutional rules and the ethical responsibilities of working with communities. The author concludes by situating her own work within this tension. Her project aligns more with participatory, creative, and arts-based approaches than with conventional social science research. Because of this, she sees her work as not fitting IRB categories neatly, which reinforces her argument that ethnography needs more flexible and humane ethical standards. In crafting an alternative ethical stance, the author explains that she consciously chose not to put her project under the control of the University Ethics Board. Instead of treating what she was doing as official research in the narrow, legal sense, she decided to place it within artistic and humanistic traditions, such as storytelling, creative writing, and performance. This move was not about escaping responsibility, but about recognizing that her project did not fit the rigid model of step-by-step, pre-planned investigation that federal rules assume. To make this choice ethically meaningful, she set herself some clear, practical limits. She decided not to seek federal funding, so her work would not fall under the regulations tied to that money. She also refused to describe what she was doing as a systematic investigation designed to develop generalizable knowledge, because that phrase did not match the open, evolving nature of her fieldwork. Instead, she grounded her ethics in the values she learned from the Rainbow family: living simply, respecting the environment, and seeing all beings as interconnected. From these values, she developed a set of personal ethical commitments. She aims to walk lightly on the earth, to care for all living beings, to act nonviolently, and to keep a heart-based ethic of care at the center of her work with people. Rather than treating ethics as a box-ticking exercise, she treats it as an ongoing, felt responsibility in how she relates to others. In this way, she frames her project as an effort to humanize ethnography, making it more humane, relational, and compassionate, rather than as an attempt to dodge rules or avoid accountability. In The Rainbow Connection, Context for the Fieldwork, the author gives a short personal history of her involvement with the Rainbow family. She first attended a rainbow gathering in 1995, and later returned multiple times between 2010 and 2012. These experiences formed the foundation of her fieldwork, giving her a long-term, lived understanding of what the gatherings feel like from the inside rather than as an outside observer. She explains that the Rainbow family is not a formal organization, but a large, temporary gathering held on public land. Anyone can attend, there are no tickets or fees, and everything runs on donations and volunteer labor. People share food, tasks, and resources freely. The entire event is based on the idea that community can be built without commercial transactions or hierarchy. The gatherings are collectively organized through open councils and group discussions. Decisions are made in circles where anyone can speak, and choices are reached through consensus rather than voting. This means the community operates without leaders, relying instead on cooperation and shared responsibility. The Rainbow Family's culture emphasizes peace, love, openness, and spiritual exploration. There is no single religion, belief system, or political agenda. People from many backgrounds come together to create a space focused on togetherness, mutual support, and respect for nature. This environment represents a kind of idealistic, experimental community that aims to model a more compassionate world. The author argues that these rainbow values can also serve as tools for teaching, for doing qualitative research, and for rethinking ethics in ethnography. Instead of approaching research through rigid rules, she proposes adopting the rainbow philosophy of openness, cooperation, care, and shared meaning-making as a guiding method for working with communities. In Rainbow as Ethical Spectacle, the author links rainbow gatherings to the concept of an ethical spectacle, a term from Stephen Duncombe. An ethical spectacle is a kind of public performance that does more than entertain. It makes a community's deepest hopes, values, and dreams visible. The Rainbow Family's gatherings, with their rituals, shared meals, music, and communal practices, become a living display of the kind of world participants want to build together. Instead of being a show for outsiders, the spectacle is created by and for the people who take part, and it is grounded in ethics rather than in commercial interests or surface-level attention. The author explains that rainbow events function as experimental spaces where people try to live out a non-commercial, cooperative, and more utopian way of life. There is no buying and selling, leadership is diffuse, and participation is open. People are encouraged to respect the environment, share resources, care for one another, and allow many different spiritual paths to coexist. This environment puts cooperation, environmental awareness, and spiritual diversity at the center, creating a kind of practice ground for alternative ways of living together. Using this, the author suggests that ethnography can learn from Rainbow's example. Instead of only describing how a community currently operates, ethnographic work can also pay attention to what that community is reaching toward, its imagined futures, its dreams of a better world, and the values it tries to embody, even if imperfectly. In other words, ethnography can focus on what could be, not just what is, by taking seriously the creative, hopeful, and experimental aspects of social life. Over time, the author comes to see that both rainbow gatherings and her own ethnographic practice can be understood as ethical spectacles. In both cases, people publicly enact different ways of relating, organizing, and caring for one another. Ethnography, when shaped by this perspective, becomes less about extracting information and more about participating in and highlighting these alternative possibilities. It becomes a way of helping others see and reflect on new forms of community, ethics, and social life that are already being tried out, even if only temporarily, in spaces like Rainbow. In redefining IRB concepts, research, human, and intervention, the author returns to the official definitions used by institutional review boards, and argues that these definitions are too narrow for the kind of work ethnographers actually do. IRB rules assume that research is tidy, predictable, and controlled, but ethnography unfolds in real-life environments where relationships, context, and meaning constantly shift. Because of this, she says ethnographic work needs broader, more flexible definitions that reflect the living, ecological nature of human interaction. She suggests redefining research not as a rigid, pre-planned investigation, but as an ongoing, evolving effort to understand how people connect, share experiences, and make sense of their lives. In this view, research becomes a process of exploration shaped by relationships rather than a strict set of procedures imposed in advance. This shift recognizes that real learning often happens in the unexpected moments, not in carefully scripted steps. The author also argues that IRBs should rethink what it means to be human within research. Instead of treating people as objects from whom data are collected, she describes humans as embodied, feeling, meaning-making beings who actively co-create knowledge with researchers. Identities, privacy, and boundaries are formed in the interactions between people, not fixed in advance, so ethics must adapt to these relational dynamics. She goes on to redefine intervention, a term IRBs use to describe actions taken on research subjects. She argues that in ethnography, interventions are not something the researcher does to participants. Instead, they are shared processes of engagement, conversation, and interpretation through which meaning emerges. The data arise from collaboration rather than extraction. Finally, she states that if IRBs and researchers adopted these more expansive definitions, ethnographic work could be more ethical, sustainable, and community-centered. It would allow researchers to engage with people in ways that honor relationships, respect context, and support more humane forms of knowledge-making. In Rainbow-Inspired Ethical Ideals for Humanizing Ethnography, the author turns the Rainbow family's values into concrete ethical guidelines for doing ethnography. One of the first commitments is to respect how people want to be named. That might mean using pseudonyms if they want privacy, or using only first names or nicknames if they prefer to be recognizable within the community, but not fully identified in public. The basic idea is that people should have a say in how they appear in the researcher's work, rather than having labels imposed on them. The author also commits to process consent, which means consent is not a one-time signature at the start, but something that continues throughout the project. When a person is named or shown in a photograph in a way that could identify them, the researcher shares the text or image with them before publication. This gives participants a chance to respond, raise concerns, or withdraw permission, so they remain involved in decisions about how their words and images are used. Transparency is another key principle. The author insists on being open about her methods, especially when she uses composite characters or blends real events with fictional elements. She aims to be clear about this both with the people in the field site and with academic readers. This openness is meant to prevent misunderstandings about what is real, what is combined, and how the story has been shaped, making the work more honest and accountable. The section also stresses an ethic of care. The author wants to approach participants in ways that minimize harm, taking into account how her work could affect both individuals and the community as a whole. This means thinking carefully about what is shared, how it is framed, and what consequences it might have. Instead of using people as data sources, she treats them as partners whose well-being matters. At the same time, she calls for ongoing self-questioning. The researcher should regularly reflect on their own role, choices, and influence, asking how their presence and decisions shape what happens. This reflexive attitude keeps the researcher open to what each field site makes possible, and prevents them from assuming they are neutral or invisible. Finally, the author links ethnography to wider social, cultural, spiritual, and political concerns. She emphasizes service, nonviolent social action, and ecological awareness, suggesting that ethnographic work can contribute to broader efforts to care for people and the planet. Ethics, in this view, is not a box to tick once for an IRB form but a continuous, negotiated process shaped together with participants over time. In Spectacular Interventions and Sustainable Ethnography, the author argues that ethnographers can create spectacular interventions, meaning they can actively demonstrate the ethical values they believe in, both while working with communities and while dealing with university systems like IRBs. Instead of simply talking about ethics, researchers can model ethical behavior through transparency, collaboration, care, and respect, turning their own actions into examples of the values they want ethnography to embody. She then imagines a more sustainable way of doing ethnography, one that avoids treating communities as places to extract data from. Instead of mining people for information, she proposes a model where fieldwork is a two-way relationship. Researchers and participants work together, share responsibility, and remain accountable to each other. This approach sees fieldwork as a long-term, reciprocal connection rather than a project with a beginning and end defined only by academic goals. The author also calls on IRBs and other ethical bodies to broaden their understanding of what counts as ethical research. She argues that oversight should take into account relationships, context, ecology, and community well-being rather than focusing only on procedural rules. A relationship-centered approach would allow approval processes to better fit the reality of ethnographic work, which depends on trust, flexibility, and careful collaboration. Finally, she points out that true ethical commitment sometimes requires difficult decisions. In some cases, the most ethical choice may be to not publish certain findings at all if releasing them could harm the community involved. Protecting people, maintaining trust, and honoring relationships may outweigh the academic benefits of producing a publication. In the final section, the author explains that her experiences with the rainbow family have permanently changed how she understands and practices ethnography. She says she cannot go back to traditional methods that pretend the researcher is separate from the people being studied. Instead, she now recognizes that she always exists in a shared space with others, shaped by mutual influence, connection, and ongoing interaction. She summarizes the core values she has taken from rainbow gatherings and applies them to ethnographic work. These include doing research that is truly for the public, not just for academic benefit, encouraging shared participation rather than top-down control, questioning mainstream assumptions in playful and creative ways, engaging communities in sustainable, respectful ways, and embracing participatory dreaming, where researchers and participants imagine better futures together. These ideals push ethnography toward a more humane and imaginative practice. The author emphasizes that ethnography should be an embodied, compassionate process. It requires recognizing both connection with others and the differences that remain between people, what she calls productive asymmetry. Rather than trying to erase these differences, ethnographers should work within them, using care and respect to guide their interactions. She also reaffirms her personal sense of identity, saying she now feels like a rainbow first and an academic second, though she does not see these identities as separate. Her commitment to rainbow values and her role as a scholar exist together, influencing one another. The paper closes by inviting readers to take up this approach themselves. The author encourages ethnographers to create their own ethical spectacles, using imagination, dreaming, and creative engagement to open new possibilities in fieldwork. She suggests that by doing so, researchers can help create more humane, hopeful, and ethical ways of understanding and working with communities. Seen through the author's eyes, a rainbow gathering begins with the long drive into a national forest, where thousands of people slowly converge to live together for a few days in a temporary city that exists outside normal commercial life. She first did this in 1995 in New Mexico, returned in 1996 in Missouri, and then, after many years away, came back to annual gatherings in Pennsylvania, Washington, and Tennessee between 2010 and 2012. This time as an ethnographer, as well as a participant, intent on understanding how the rainbow family constitutes itself communicatively in this improvised environment. The gathering itself is built on public land between 1 and 7 July, with no ticket booths or fences and no price of admission. Instead, people enter freely, and the entire event runs on donated food, labor, and supplies. As she walks into camp, she does not encounter a central stage or a command post, but a loose network of families and kitchens spread through the woods and meadows. Governance takes the form of open councils and circles where anyone can speak, and major decisions are made through consensus rather than voting, so that no one person or group can claim authority over the rest. She sees that rainbow has no formal hierarchy, whether someone is wealthy or unhoused outside the forest. Here everyone is simply family and is encouraged to contribute in ways that matter. The phrase "anyone with a belly button is family" captures how the group extends kinship to all humans and, by metaphor, to all living beings. Moving through camp, the author notices that home is made through work. People plug in by chopping vegetables and stirring huge pots in open-air kitchens, staffing makeshift medical spaces, performing in small campfire theaters, digging and maintaining latrines, assembling hand-washing stations, and hauling water and supplies up and down the hills. The site itself has been chosen over months of discussion. A vision council meets on 7th of July of the previous gathering, scouts identify possible locations, and later councils confirm the final choice, so each year's forest clearing carries the memory of earlier debates and dreams. Around her, people describe rainbow as a gathering for peace, love, sharing, openness, togetherness, and spiritual exploration, but there is no single doctrine. Instead, many paths coexist in one place. Her personal experience of these spaces is shaped by the sense that rainbow is deliberately trying to build a small, temporary world, different from Babylon, its term for mainstream society. The gathering aims to be a sustainable city, organized around environmental awareness, interfaith dialogue, free speech, spiritual freedom, and the right to gather peacefully. She learns that the community sees itself as an experiment in cooperative living, where simple relationships of cooperation and volunteerism are treated as keys to the future, teaching respect for earth, water, plants, and animals, and reminding people of the value of laughter, music, celebration, and rejoicing in life. The sounds she associates with rainbow are not just drums or guitars, but council voices, poems and stories shared in circles, and wisdom offered from the seven corners of the earth. Looking back, she remembers being drawn to rainbow because it let people live even briefly together in a state of expanded freedom, and because it taught and required cooperation in ways she did not find elsewhere. Over multiple gatherings, the community changes how she sees the world, convincing her that rainbow is a spectacle in the sense of a visible performance of another possible reality, a utopian project half-actualized, that brings people back year after year, in the hope that one day the whole world might live like this. For her, walking the trails between campsites, sitting in circles, and sharing food and work, become part of an ethical spectacle that shows what cooperative, non-commercial, participatory life could look like, even if only for a short time. At the same time, the gatherings also push her to confront the limits and contradictions of this dream. She sees how rainbow, despite aiming to contrast itself with Babylon, sometimes reproduces the very inequalities and tensions it tries to leave behind, and she recognizes that her own research can also fall short of its ethical ambitions. Later, away from the forest and back at her desk, she recalls these scenes while sifting through piles of field notes and stories, only to realize that fully writing about rainbow's struggles and failures, or offering detailed prescriptions for how it might do things differently, could expose the community in ways that might harm it. That realization becomes another key personal moment. As she weighs the pleasure of sharing rainbow's dreams on display against the risk of hurting people she has come to care about, she decides not to publish the full ethnographic project at all, even though this choice delays her PhD and complicates her job search. In making that decision, she returns to the same values she saw enacted in camp, the emphasis on care, cooperation, respect for all beings, and the commitment to do no harm, and lets them guide her academic life as much as they guided her time in the woods. In the end, the picture that emerges from her stories is of rainbow as both a physical gathering in the forest and a long-term relationship that has reshaped her sense of self. She describes herself as rainbow first and academic second, refusing to draw sharp lines between these identities, because her experiences on the land, in circles, kitchens, and trails, now inform the way she thinks about research, ethics, and community. Through her eyes, a rainbow gathering is not just tents in a meadow, but a recurring attempt to build a more cooperative, loving, and ecologically aware way of living together, one that continues to influence her even when she leaves the forest and returns to the institutions that struggle to make sense of what she has seen.